So, I think one of the most striking developments of the past few years has been this growing focus on sustainability in financial services. And I think just about every session of this conference has mentioned environmental, social, and governance, or ESG issues. And of course, the Saudi G20 presidency has framed its agenda as realizing opportunities for the 21st century for all. So that focus on being inclusive, highlighting the need for inclusive growth and the need for private finance to transition to an environmentally sustainable and more equitable economy. In other words, financing a just transition. I will say that phrase is completely not in the American vocabulary. If you say just transition to an American, they have no idea what that means, but it's a very common phrase in Europe and the UK. So our industry is under tremendous pressure to step up to the plate here. You see major new commitments on green finance announced just about every day, it seems. Clearly, the regulatory steer is a big factor. The number of sustainable finance policy initiatives globally has risen from about 0 back in 2005 to over 650 today. Think about it. 650 different initiatives on sustainable finance in different jurisdictions. Green taxonomy, ESG disclosure, stress testing, scaling up funding for the SDGs, and much more. And a whole range of different actors, the network for greening the financial system, which is central banks and supervisors. The European Union has been tremendously active. Their action plan on sustainable finances has a very comprehensive and granular taxonomy and a big body of work on green product labeling and benchmarks and investor protection. This year, their focus is increasingly on disclosure. All that plus the Green Deal to decarbonize the European economy. And I mention this because in many ways, this is going to serve as an effective template for other jurisdictions as they think about their own strategies for sustainable finance. And of course, the traditional standard setters, the Financial Stability Board, the Basel Committee, IOSCO, the insurance supervisors, and others are also looking at sustainability issues and climate risk. And the IMF, the managing director noted last night, is also undertaking work on climate risk, which will inform these standard setters. So we're getting increasingly concerned about regulatory and policy fragmentation. We're therefore urging the G20 to consider a renewed sustainability agenda that brings together key policy discussions with finance ministers, central banks, regulators, multilaterals. Climate change is a global problem, and it needs a global solution to help scale up sustainable finance from the billions to the trillions. And as the private financial sector and the development finance community forge ahead with innovative green products and sustainable investment, we're really fortunate to have a great panel here today to give us a sense of how they're seeing things. So, Faisal, some of the biggest ESG challenges over the next decade are going to be in developing economies, many of them located in hot tropical places in climate vulnerable zones. So how is the Saudi Fund for Development working to support the Sustainable Development Goals in developing economies?
First of all, allow me to thank you for organizing this conference and allowing me to participate in this session, and I hope my participation add a value to our conversation. Since the establishment of the Saudi Fund for Development in 1975, we have financed more than 1,000 projects in developing countries throughout Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe, without having any differentiation between all those countries in regard of ethnic or religious differentiation. We have worked in 84 countries. And since then, if you go back to all of our activities, you'll find out that we are supporting the Sustainable Development Goals that were set recently by the United Nations. One of which is hydropower projects. We have financed around 22 projects with 28 loans. The total cost of those projects goes up to 4 billion riyals. Some of those projects are mega projects that we have to finance along with the sister institutions. One of the big dam that was constructed in Sudan, and it was completed in 2010. Mirwi Dam, maybe most of you know it. It produces right now 1,250 megawatt of hydropower project, which is considered to be renewable power. And throughout that, we find ourselves supporting the sustainable development goals throughout our operations. We mainly provide high concessional loans. The grant element varies between 35 up to 65%. And also we provide some grants on behalf of the government of Saudi Arabia. That's mainly in regard of the power generation. If you are talking about the water sector, we also support projects in developing countries through either grants or highly concessional loans. We have designed the Saudi program for well drilling in rural areas in Africa, and that program is covering 16 African countries, and it's purely a grant-based program. Through that program, we have already equipped 6,000 water points, and 2.5 million people have benefited from that program. It went through multiple phases. The last phase is phase 5. It's an ongoing phase right now. That's basically in regard of the Sustainable Development Goals. And as you just mentioned, that how we find ourselves. We found ourselves at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals through our operations, and this is once they are approved, we aligned our operations to be just classified alongside with the goals, and we have them more focused on the overarching goal of the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
That's really informative. I think there's probably not a lot of widespread knowledge about how much you're doing in some of these countries. So, thank you for sharing that. Anwar, you know, we've talked about on a number of occasions rising debt levels for governments, not just in mature markets. Everybody knows we're running tons of debt in Europe and Japan, but also emerging economies. So, how do you see this as a constraint, a potential constraint on funding social development goals?
It's a huge constraint, because actually if you take the overall number of debt, it's 30% of GDP. And this is for everybody. If you take just the emerging market, it's close to 170% of debt to GDP. If you take the frontier market, so the ones who are even more vulnerable within the emerging market space, it's 114% debt to GDP, which is really, and yet it has hit a record high. So it's exactly your point, is when you are a country that needs to refinance and has substantial refinancing needs in a given year, most of which are in US dollars, i.e. not in your currencies, what do you prioritize? You, of course, prioritize the fact that you have to refinance. So you go for the necessary, if not easy path, and actually it's now shown and is now evidence that the spending on the sustainable goals are slowly decreasing. You can now have an historical path that shows you this in those high indebted countries. So your question is exactly to the point. It's actually happening as we speak, that the spending is decreasing. And at the same time, of course, some of those countries have issues around revenue collection. So if you add the two, there is little and less room to spend for those long-term goals.
That's terrifying, isn't it? I mean, to think that at a time when you've got $2.5 trillion, I think, of aggregate need in emerging markets for the SDGs, what you're saying is that there's a declining trend of governments being able to finance them.
Yes, it's a clear trend that you can see as a trend in spending for those particular goals. And just another point of reference, which I think is interesting. You have 255 billion that needs to be refinanced this year in loan bonds, everything for the frontier market. So it also shows you the amount and the numbers that has to be refinanced, that is the top of the mind of the people who have to be dealing with it in the countries. And 40% of this is in US dollar, so which also has an increasing risk and increasing gap in the whole thing.
Well, it's a good thing interest rates are low then. Better
Yes.
stay that way. Zainab, you know, this really brings up the key role of the private sector. And governments just don't have the resources to fund all their development goals. So what do you think is the best approach to scaling up private funding? And are you seeing more client demand for ESG investment?
Absolutely. So I think candidly the best way to scale up funding in relation to ESG issues and SDGs is to prove the case for enhanced financial returns and move away from thinking that this is a good thing to do or the right thing to do for PR purposes to really the bottom line. And to make sure that companies that consider ESG issues in their day-to-day activities actually create sustainable value creation over the long term. As we move to kind of a low carbon world, which is inevitable. So I think this is certainly something that we've incorporated into our investment process at Invesco and considering that from an engagement perspective. I think, and we, from an investor and a client base, we're certainly seeing investors consider that more actively. We've seen that around the world with our institutional investors, and this is a trend that's been continuing. I think, and we've actually interestingly just published a white paper in conjunction with Cambridge University that has talked about the benefits of engaging companies in kind of their ESG issues, or certainly the impacts of the SDGs versus just simple exclusion. So I think the case is certainly being proven, and institutional investors are coming around to that idea. I think the second part of it is that we as an industry need to provide product, that kind of have links to ESG issues or have links to the new world that we will embark on. We've seen the proliferation of green bonds. I think there's about 1,600 issues the last time we checked. SDG-related bonds, sustainability bonds, all types of colors as well of bonds. I think there's the challenges remain, though, with regards to quality of data and disclosure and lack of common standards. And I think that until we kind of sort that out as an industry, and that is an iterative process, then we're not going to see the type of funding that we would hope for.
Indeed, there are those that say demand is rising at such an extent there's not enough supply of SDG-linked products to invest in.
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing the rise in it, absolutely. Certainly on the credit side, and on the equity side, we're seeing the rise of SRI type products. But again, from an Invesco standpoint, we do believe in engagement versus kind of specific negative screens or positive screens.
Thank you. So, Jan, maybe you can put all of this into a ratings agency perspective. I think it's reasonably new, this idea that ratings explicitly incorporate environmental, social, governance factors in sovereign ratings. Well, how are these relevant to credit assessment?
Yeah, let me start with this. So, most of you will know what a Swiss Army knife is. It has a saw, a knife, a scissors, maybe a toothpick. And none of them really work very well because they're not specialized. Ratings, sovereign ratings, are not like a Swiss Army knife. They're more like the chainsaw. They are focusing only on one thing and want to do this one thing good, and that is getting the default risk correct. Now, that does not mean that we ignore ESG-related risks. To the very contrary. Governance in particular has been a very, very important factor driving into our ratings for quite a long time. And that's really something that is very, very important. We get a lot of complaints from governments that we focus on politics and governance, where they say, why don't you look at our fiscal balance and our current account, just ignore all these politics. But we have done studies that around 25% of defaults are directly related and caused by political problems. And another 33% of the defaults that we have encountered at least have political issues, governance issues as a facilitating factor. So governance certainly is very, very important in the ratings. It feeds in, for example, via World Bank governance indicators that we take very seriously. Social, so going through the ESG governance is in there. Social is certainly also reflected, and in this region, the Arab Spring clearly was an important lesson that social factors are very important, and we need to look at things like unemployment and inequality as potential factors that might lead to latent pressure that at some stage might explode. Environmental of the three is probably the thing that feeds least into the ratings. There are, I think, two sovereigns where we have a direct implication on the environmental side. And I must say the whole discussion over the last 2 years has probably focused us more on this. So we really look more closely on the environmental side. So far, we still believe that over the time horizon that we look, generally the implications are not sufficient to really have a notch down, for example, on specific risks. But we certainly take that quite seriously as well.
So it sounds like you're saying almost that if you're looking, say, at a social unrest in Latin America, that might become an explicit factor in the sovereign rating in some way.
Right. So it's not just when the social unrest arises, but of course what we want to capture, we are about risk. We are not about the problems arising. We want to capture the latency, the risk of major unrest that is destabilizing, that is causing problems for creditworthiness. And so we also look at the indicators such as inequality, as I say, or unemployment, or similar issues, or divisions in the country, that certainly also factors into our considerations.
Well, Anne-Laure, maybe we can pick up on some of these questions, maybe with a focus on the countries that both have high debt levels and are in climate vulnerable areas. There are an awful lot of those in tropical zones. Are there ways that, better debt management, the kind of advice that you're giving, or maybe some fancy climate bonds or hurricane bonds can help them avoid this kind of climate debt trap?
Yes, so to your question, and first I'd like to react to your point. It's interesting to know that in the green bonds space, 95% of the green bonds issued are investment grade. And the more people who issue are the UK, France, Germany, Japan also. I mean, those are big names, right? While in emerging market, it's extremely low and extremely minimal. So I just wanted to point this out because it also leads to your question. So actually, what is happening? Indeed, most of the countries who have high debt also are in the regions that are most hit by climate change. So they are double defavorized, if you want. And actually, and there is a very good study that has been done on it, that shows that those countries actually usually have a cost of their loans and of their debt that is roughly 150 basis points over the average of anybody else, just plain as is, without any catastrophe, just as a matter of fact. So what it means is that to start with, they already have something like 40 or 50, depending on the length of the period that you look at, of interest increase versus the other people. So they already start with a situation that is defavorized. And then when you add on to an issue and to a disaster, what does it mean? Typically, for Dominica, for example, the cost of what happened with the last climate issue, with the Hurricane Maria, was 200 of their GDP. So it's actually almost impossible to face this, right? And the numbers are extremely, extremely high. So there are no real single solution. The couple of things that you can do are, when it comes to policy making, trying to plan ahead as much as you can to invest into structures, infrastructures that are as solid as you can. And some countries do this. Actually, the World Bank is also involved in some of those programs. The IMF also supports this type of approach. So you have to plan ahead. And studies there also show you that if you've planned ahead, you're better off than, of course, having to deal with it afterwards, even if you have an event happening. So this is the first thing that you can do. The second thing that you can do is to be ready financially. What does it mean? It either means that you can have insurances, but those are extremely high, and the private sector is not very willing to take on those because of same with the numbers. You know, when you have funds of insurance between countries, those are 100 million type of funds of countries being together. And when there is a problem in a country, the amount of money that you have to disburse can be several billions. So it's a complete mismatch between the amount of money that you can have in insurance funds and the actual need that you have, basically. So what it means is that you have to go through something different than just the insurance. So certainly, private sector money can help, but public sector can be and should be a lot, because it needs to be very concessional rates and low rates as much as you can. And on the private sector, certainly things like indeed the Green Bond Initiative, but being much more kind of like popularized with those countries and not just to the investment grade countries. And also certainly at some point the development of the local markets, also to avoid the currency mismatch and also to be able just to generate some demand there.
Sounds like also the Saudi Development Fund could be helpful here. You had mentioned concessional lending.
Okay. Here where the development institutions jump in and try to help by providing very concessional loans and grants, and to finance projects that are not attractive for private investors, where we can pave and attract the investors to come in and invest their money and try to be engaged with the national economy of that developing country. Basically, in the Saudi Fund for Development, we are guided by the IMF, and we consider all the countries that are considered as HIPC countries, and we provide them with IDA conditions. We go down to like 40 years, 10 years grace period, and in some cases, 0 interest rate, no commitment fees, no management fees. That's purely concessional loans in a way where you can help that country to elevate their economy and to graduate from what they are suffering right now to prepare them to face the next stage of their evaluation by the IMF, and hopefully they graduate to be middle, lower income, and that's our way of dealing with the developing countries.
If I could just follow up on that quickly, perhaps leveraging your own balance sheet in partnership with the private sector as well, is that just G2G, okay, all right, yeah, because that's a hot topic too in
That's what we do, basically. We try to SFD is working on government basis. We provide developing countries with concessional loans based on their requests, and once we receive their official requests along with the feasibility studies and assessing their projects, at that time we decide whether we step in and provide them with the loan they need. And also we assess their debt stress. Are they able to receive more loans or not? Those are very important criteria that we consider once we approve our loans by our board.
So, Zainab, we've been talking a bit about the development side of it and the building local currency markets, but on the private sector side, how well do you think investment owners, asset owners, and managers are pricing these climate risks and broader ESG risks? And what are some of the challenges you see maybe around disclosure or?
Yeah, I think obviously there's a couple of sides to the risk, right? There's the physical risks in terms of, the risks of extreme weather events, impacting property or your actual business, and there's the transition risk. I think in terms of this, I guess I want to talk about it in terms of sort of challenges and opportunities, if I may. So I think challenges center around sort of the lack of a global price for carbon, right? So this makes it very difficult to be completely objective in terms of assessing the impact of hydrocarbons on individual businesses, and to really assess where the laggards in which industries will fall behind. I think so. The problem is it's left up to the individuals to take that view of risk, and that makes it quite difficult for consistency across the industry. I think we talked about the disclosure and lack of quality data. That makes it quite difficult to really integrate the risks and price it within investment portfolios. Thirdly, I think the frameworks that are in place from TCFD to stewardship codes and things like that are still voluntary, right? So there's not going to be, until there's regulatory change and enforcing sort of companies and investment managers like ourselves that we're already signatories, but I think that's not sort of across the board. So I think some of these challenges remain that make it quite difficult to have a uniform way to assess risk, to integrate that into sort of ESG frameworks. But what we're seeing is actually that more and more investors, more and more asset managers like ourselves are assessing materiality on a sector-by-sector basis, and the impact of climate change and other ESG issues on our underlying portfolios. So I think that we've discounted sort of cash flow expectations as a result of some of these scenario analysis that we've conducted. So I think it is being priced in, is starting to be priced in more and more. There are certain sectors that are stuck. I mean, you see the oil and gas sector, for example, and the reflections of that in the share price. There are plenty of companies in that sector that are, for example, doing plenty of capex and not paying out in dividends, and have on the front of it very good environmental policies, but their share prices are not really sort of going anywhere, and that's leading to the term stranded assets, I guess, if you extrapolate that. So I think investors and asset owners and asset management companies are certainly starting to consider and price in some of those risks, maybe not as explicitly because of the lack of the uniform standards, but it's certainly being considered more and more. And so I'm relatively encouraged by that, I think. So yes, I think it's a work in progress.
I think you raise a very good point on the disclosure, and I think that's going to be a big focus this year on the toolkit for disclosure, right? So it's one thing to say we need mandatory disclosure, else we don't have the information. Well, you also don't have the data and the tools to provide the disclosure, so it gets a bit chicken and egg. But Faisal, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, on the carbon tax, was it? Just on what Ms. Zainab just mentioned about the social and environmental risks, that we are also facing a very big challenge in this regard, in regard of the land acquisitions of the developing projects, and also the environmental assessment. There's a substantial amount of funding hanging in our funding specified for X amount of countries, and they are unable to withdraw from that funding because of the risk and the risk of social and environmental aspects. And one example is Kendaji Dam that was assessed in the 1980s, and today they weren't able to start implementing that dam because of the social impact where they will displace a number of residents from their current land, which extends from Niger to Mali. So the social and environmental risk is quite high, and it's affecting our operations for the time being. Thank you.
So in fact, you actually predicted a question that came in from the audience, but I would like to kind of expand on this a little, and people can volunteer to answer it. The question is around the carbon tax, and as you say, the lack of a global carbon tax is a challenge. And the question is that is there a solution for the problems? So, for example, jurisdictions that have a carbon tax might experience the problem of investment going elsewhere where there isn't a carbon tax, so sort of a tax arbitrage question. Do you see any maybe prospects for a global carbon tax, that would truly be global, or other solutions around these areas? Anybody want to take this? It's a tough one.
I mean, maybe just the French experience where the president implemented some measures to raise fuel prices, triggering essentially the Gilets jaunes movement to some extent as a consequence. Just shows how extremely socially sensitive these kind of things are, and that makes me unfortunately quite skeptical about finding a consensus that is relatively broad on this. It will be very, very hard. It is hard to implement that in individual countries. Some have made some progress, some have made less progress, but it will be very hard to implement that to the extent that would be necessary to get the changes that are required, and do that on a global scale. Very, very difficult.
It's a little bit back to your initial question around, short-term dealing and long-term dealing. Because if you are about the long-term, you need to deal with those things. And indeed, and the case of France is, of course, very interesting. If you asked anybody in France, do you care about ecology? Everybody does. But they are not willing to take the hit on their portfolio, on their money right away of what they earn. So it's all a balance about short-term, long-term, and being able to indeed convince people that they should be long-term, or they should be at least considering the long-term more than they should consider the short-term.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and one that comes up again and again in discussion, including around the question of fiduciary duty, right? What is an investor's fiduciary duty? Is it simply to sort of maximize returns in the here and now, or is it needing to take a much longer term approach? So, Zainab, you must see a lot of these questions come up around things like, governance issues like proxy voting, stewardship, engagement. Are we kind of moving toward a different way of thinking about what it means to be a fiduciary?
Yes, absolutely. I think I talked at the beginning about sort of exclusion policies that some asset management companies have adopted versus engagement. And certainly for us as an active fund manager, engagement has been key. I think utilizing our proxy voting policies, signing up to the stewardship codes, really talking to companies. And I think there's probably a link between the E and the G here. So traditionally, G issues, governance issues have been part and parcel of investing in an active way, meaning sort of companies assessing the quality of the board, composition of the board, and so on. But what we've seen is a link to companies that have robust G policies and how that translates into the E. And I think investors are also interestingly waking up to the fact and linking those two letters together. I think for us, like I said, engagement is key. In order to create sort of sustainable engagements and sustainable value out of the companies that we invest in, there's no use in just excluding them from our portfolio. A lot of them are innovating. A lot of them are looking into more sustainable ways to transition to our new world. And I think it's our job as fiduciaries and as representative of long-term investors to help them do that. For us, we're very passionate about that, and we do see that as part of our long-term fiduciary responsibility. So I think that, the world is coming around to that thinking. So we're very encouraged by that, certainly.
Analogous in a way to banks providing lending for transition. It's the same concept of investing so as to facilitate transition.
Yes, absolutely. And this is, again, coming back to the proliferation of green bonds and sustainable bonds. There is a huge appetite for that. And I think where we've seen that is in the sovereign space too. Central banks specifically, as the regulators themselves, but also they've got certain restrictions because their investment objectives are around not purely investment, but around liquidity and reserve management. So there's not so much they can do in the equity space, for example, but they're willing to invest in the green economy, and the one way to do that is through green bonds. And you raise an interesting point about sort of how the industry is maturing. But again, the industry is still far too small for them to allocate in a meaningful way.
Exactly. Well, Jan, maybe you can tell us a little bit about, in a ratings context, right? So the time horizon on ratings is typically shorter term, right? So, but with this greater focus on ESG, how can investors use your tools, your framework to incorporate ESG into their own investment processes?
Yeah, so I think investors have two needs on the ESG side. One is some investors just want as sustainable investment as possible, and for that they need essentially a ranking of really the greenness of their investment. The other need is investors who want to make sure that ESG risks are sufficiently incorporated. We certainly deal with this second approach. So we have an ESG score that gives an indication of the degree to which, say, environmental, social, and governance factors are affecting our ratings. And you can incorporate that into your process in your analysis of the risks of default and risks to the credit. I think there is a separate discussion to be had for the first point, for the first type. And I think there the issue is still that we need to still learn and discuss the many different types of demands that we are having. There are people who may still be happy in cleaning up very dirty industries, and there are people who just would not want to touch these industries. And finding and classifying these kind of differences is a separate job. It's separate from the riskiness to the credit, to the repayment.
Yeah, and thinking about kind of incorporating ESG risks into a framework, and Laura, I'm thinking about what IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva said last night, saying ESG factors would be an increasing part of IMF surveillance work. She called them macro-critical, I think was the term. So in your advisory work then, in the governments that you advise, are you seeing more demand for help in responding to this kind of surveillance?
Yes, there is a clear demand for help on this. And actually, the IMF already has the beginning of a frame. They are refining it, and it's called the Disaster Reliance Strategy, and it has 3 pillars that are identified. And it's, for the moment, it's a paper that they kind of like still need to further refine in order to kind of like then lead it to implementation. But it has already shown results, and some countries are using this frame or this paper to be tested and to see what can happen. And it has helped some other countries like Belize and so on to take more of their budget and to look more into how much of their budget they put into this, in particular, climate initiative. So for sure, the IMF has a role to play, and for sure, we're seeing this. What we are also seeing is an important thing. You remember all the CAC clause and how difficult it was to have them in the bonds, right? Now, I think everybody needs to think about the lobbying around the Hurricane clause, which got incorporated in the latest Barbados restructuring, for example, but are still not standard. ICMA is asking for a 3-year deferral. It just got 2 years in Barbados, so you can certainly do much more, and you can build there a frame, which would be very helpful for the countries to have. So some lobbying also needs to be done there.
Really interesting. So, Faisal, I wanted to come to you for a kind of a big picture, long-term question. So, you know, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has set out a really ambitious sort of Vision 2030 plan to look, including at economic diversification and reducing reliance on oil, so all of these factoring in ESG issues. So how is the Saudi Fund for Development supporting the Kingdom's Vision 2030?
Since the announcement of Vision 2030, we started internally to develop our own transformation plan to align our operations and the overall goal with the Vision 2030 goals in a way where we can benefit the recipient country along with our local content. Basically, what we do, we try to engage the private sector internally here in Saudi Arabia with the recipient country and try to benefit the recipient country from the experience and the strength that we have here internally, and to exchange knowledge with any other international companies who are pioneers in some specific fields where we can implement a project that is financed through SFD, and then our private sector might be able to come back with the new technologies and enrich our domestic economy by getting that knowledge. And we are trying to be the international gate for our domestic firms. 2 days ago, on Thursday, we received in our headquarters the Minister of Finance of Madagascar. And during our discussion, he was amazed by the quality of water services and the quality of water that he has observed during his visit. And he asked a question. He said, you are considered one of the poorest countries in regard of water resources, and at the same time you are enjoying very high quality water services. Would you be kind to send your expertise who are enriching this sector from Saudi Arabia to Madagascar? And we express our willingness, but that depends on the project. And that was just an example on the mutual benefit that could be out of our operations, and that will directly support Vision 2030.
So now I have a lightning round question for each of you here, as we're nearly at the end of our time. When you think back, let's say 5 years ago, what proportion of your time was spent then thinking about ESG type issues or sustainability, and what proportion do you spend now?
So we're a global house. I'm speaking about Invesco. We're a global house, and I think we've seen leaders in kind of the ESG issues, obviously in the Nordics, in kind of the West with the Canadian pension funds, Australian supers, and so on. And so it was a relatively nascent field 5 years ago, but you know, we thought investors were starting to consider it. Fast forward to now, and we commissioned a report actually on sovereign investors, and I wanted to kind of make it relevant to this region. I think it's at the forefront of everybody's mind. Right now in the 2019 report that we commissioned, we found that over 60% of sovereign investors have top-down ESG policies integrated in their frameworks. And that is probably unthinkable 5 years ago, especially for some of the hydrocarbon-producing economies of this region. And we've seen their leadership take place with the One Planet initiative, for example. And so, yeah, extremely excited by the prospect of long-term sovereign savings vehicles taking the leadership in that regard.
Alors?
Honestly, 5 years ago, zero time. You know, it was, no one really wanted to focus on it. They wanted us to take care of their immediate needs. Now, I would say it depends, but it's certainly something closer to 20%. But what is interesting too is that it tends to be in the countries that have the highest rating, where it's a priority, and we're asked to work on it. And for the countries that are really emerging market, unless really they are restructuring their debt because of climate issues, but it's not so much of a priority. It still goes after other priorities that they have on their kind of like day-to-day.
So maybe the easiest way to frame it is for us, how much time in our committees do we spend on ESG issues? And I'm not really sure that much has changed. So I'm covering the Middle East and Africa region, and politics, of course, has always been very, very important in that region. Social issues have long been a very, very important concern. What is true, so I would, given that these things don't change all that fast, we don't maybe give this the time that we give in terms of the weight of the issues. So maybe 10-20% on governance and social issues. What has changed is that we do spend a little bit more time on the environmental side. But I think what the discussion about ESG over the last few years has done is, I think it has opened our horizons, the length of thinking a little bit more. We still focus on the same rating horizon that we have been having, but we are also thinking more about the long term in the ESG context, but I think also in a more general context.
I would say we used to actually before 5 years, and even now we still consider the environmental and social aspects in our assessment, but recently we consider them more, and we even integrated them within our assessment formula that we have in order to approve our projects. I would say 10% and 10%.
Interesting, and now I'm going to ask for a show of hands from the audience, from those who see a materially larger part of their time spent thinking about sustainability and ESG type issues now versus 5 years ago. It's a good proportion. I guess that's not surprising. You wouldn't be here this late in the afternoon if you weren't very interested in these issues. So with that, please join me in thanking our panel for a splendid discussion, and thank you for being here.